September 1st, 1943. The air at Rabaul Airfield is thick, a heavy mixture of humidity, volcanic dust, and the sweet scent of aviation fuel. Inside an operations tent, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai, a living legend, a warrior of the skies, holds a sheet of paper in his hand. One eye is now completely white, a permanent reminder left by the tail gunner of an American Dauntless bomber. But his good eye, the one that has guided him to more than 60 aerial victories, scans the intelligence report, and then a sound cuts through the oppressive air. It's laughter, not a quiet chuckle. It's a deep, genuine, dismissive laugh. He reads the words aloud to the other pilots, the elite of the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service. The Americans have a new fighter. They call it the Hellcat. The name itself is absurd, a piece of brutal American marketing, but it's the technical specifications that are truly comical. Our intelligence suggests it weighs nearly 6 tons, twice our Zero. More laughter fills the tent, twice the weight. For these men, artists who painted death in the sky with aircraft that seemed like extensions of their own bodies, this was madness. They flew the Mitsubishi A6M0, a plane so light, so agile, it could outturn anything the Allies had ever thrown at them. For 2 years, the Zero had been the undisputed master of the Pacific. It was a scalpel, a fencing sword, a whisper in the wind, and the Americans were sending a fat, heavy, clumsy hammer to fight it. Through the tent flaps, Sakai could see them lined up on the steel-plated runway, his squadron's Zeros. They were beautiful, elegant, and incredibly lethal. They had swept the skies of British Hurricanes, American P-40s, and Dutch Brewster Buffaloes. They were the embodiment of a warrior philosophy that privileged skill, spirit, and agility over brute force. This new American plane, this Hellcat, was an insult. It was a flying truck. It was the continuation of a failed American design, philosophy that tried to solve problems by throwing more metal at them. The consensus in the tent was clear. The Hellcat would be another easy victim, a footnote in the glorious history of the Zero. But what Saburo Sakai and every pilot laughing in that tent could not possibly know was that this joke, this overweight, ugly American machine, was not just a new plane. It was a death sentence. It was the physical manifestation of an industrial and tactical philosophy, so powerful, so ruthless that it would not only defeat the Zero, it would systematically annihilate Japanese naval aviation. In less than 2 years, this design failure would be responsible for over 5,000 Japanese aircraft shot down. It would achieve a staggering kill ratio of 19-1. The laughter in that tent was the last echo of an era. The era of the Zero was over. The age of the Hellcat was about to begin, and it would be born in fire and fury, rewriting the entire mathematics of air power and transforming the Pacific sky from a dueling ground into a slaughterhouse. To understand the total shock that the Hellcat represented, you first have to understand the myth, the legend of the plane it was built to destroy, the Mitsubishi A6M0. In late 1941 and early 42, the Zero was less an aircraft and more a force of nature. It appeared in the skies over Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and Singapore like a ghost, a silver phantom that defied the known laws of aeronautics. Allied pilots who encountered it and survived spoke in hushed, incredulous tones. They described a fighter that could climb like a rocket and turn on a dime, dancing in circles around their slow aircraft. The numbers were so unbalanced they seemed like propaganda. At Pearl Harbor, the Japanese lost only 29 aircraft, while destroying or crippling over 300 American planes. In the conquest of the Philippines, it was 7 losses against 103 destroyed. The story was the same everywhere. The Zero was invincible. When American engineers finally got their hands on a captured Zero, in 1942, the Akutan Zero, they were baffled. They ran the performance tests, and at first refused to believe them. A fighter with the range of a light bomber, the agility of a pre-war biplane, and the firepower to shred anything it faced, it seemed impossible. The secret was a design philosophy as brilliant as it was brutal. The Zero's designer, Jiro Horikoshi, had been given an impossible task: create a carrier-based fighter that was faster, more agile, and had greater range than any land-based fighter in the world. To achieve this goal, he made a pact with the devil. He sacrificed everything, and I mean everything, for performance. The Zero was built with a top-secret aluminum alloy called extra super duralumin, making its airframe incredibly strong, yet light as a feather. But this was only the beginning. There was no armor to protect the pilot. A single bullet in the right spot and the man flying the plane was dead. There were no self-sealing tanks. A stray shot could turn the entire aircraft into a ball of fire. The radio was often removed to save a few extra pounds. Every single component was scrutinized, and if it wasn't absolutely essential for flight or combat, it was discarded. The result was a masterpiece of minimalist design. Its wing loading, the amount of weight each square meter of wing must support, was incredibly low, just 10 kilograms per square meter square. This gave it a phenomenal turning radius of just over 200 meters. It could literally fly circles around its adversaries. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, Japan's future ace of aces, wrote in his diary, "Flying the Zero is like wearing wings. The aircraft responds to thought, not just control input. American planes fly like trucks, powerful but clumsy. They build fighters like they build cars, heavy, oversized, wasteful." This was the fundamental belief of the Japanese Naval Air Service. They believed in the supremacy of the pilot, the samurai spirit, enhanced by an aircraft that was a pure extension of his will. They saw air combat as an art form, a duel of skill, and in the hands of their artists, the Zero was the perfect brush. So when the first intelligence reports on the Grumman F-6F Hellcat arrived in early 1943, they were met with total disdain. The specifications read like a list of everything a fighter shouldn't be. Its loaded weight was over 5,500 kilograms. The Zero was barely 2,600. Its wing loading was a ponderous 17 kilograms per square meter, which suggested a turning radius of nearly 300 meters. In the turning maneuvers that Japanese pilots had mastered, the Hellcat would be easy prey. It was a brick, and the list went on. It carried armor everywhere, 96 kilograms just to protect the pilot. It had bulletproof glass. Its fuel tanks were massive and self-sealing, adding hundreds of kilograms of weight. It carried 2,400 rounds of ammunition for its 650 caliber machine guns. It was everything the Zero was not: heavy, complex, and built to survive, not just for performance. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had planned the Pearl Harbor attack, reviewed the specifications and wrote a dismissive analysis that would become infamous. "The Americans have learned nothing," he concluded. "This Hellcat represents the continuation of their failed philosophy, attempting to overcome pilot skill with a weight of machinery. A Zero will fly circles around it." The mathematics seemed to prove him right. The entire Japanese tactical doctrine was built around turning combat. Enter a horizontal circle with the enemy. Use the Zero's superior agility to get on his tail and finish him. Based on the numbers, the Hellcat was designed to lose that battle every single time. The Japanese pilots laughed because they saw the Hellcat not as a threat, but as confirmation of their superiority. They were the artists, the samurai. The Americans were just factory workers churning out clumsy machines. They believed they were fighting a war of spirit, and the Hellcat was a soulless beast of iron. They were about to learn in the most brutal way imaginable that they had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the war they were fighting. The Americans weren't coming to duel. They were coming to exterminate. The first hint that something was terribly wrong with this picture came on September 30th, 1943, near Marcus Island. Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui was a veteran Zero pilot escorting a reconnaissance plane. He knew the sky. He knew its rhythms, its dangers, its predictable patterns. When he spotted 6 dark blue shapes climbing from the southeast, his brain processed them through the lens of his experience. His first thought, recorded in his after-action report, was that they were B-25 bombers flying a strange route. They were too big, too massive to be fighters. Then the shapes turned and Fukui saw the silhouette for the first time. A single massive radial engine, a thick barrel-chested fuselage, and wings that looked almost comically short and stubby for such a large body. First encounter with F-6F type fighter, he wrote later. Initial impression, the Americans have mounted fighter guns on a torpedo bomber. It was an ugly, brutish-looking thing. Fouquet felt no fear, only a sense of professional curiosity. He and his wingman would deal with this lumbering beast using the time-honored tactics that had never failed them. He rolled his Zero into a diving turn, the standard opening move. The plan was simple. Use the Zero's exquisite agility to cut inside the clumsy American's turn, get on his tail, and send him burning into the Pacific. He expected the heavy American fighter to continue straight, unable to follow his nimble maneuver. He would curve neatly onto its 6 o'clock position, a position from which no Allied pilot had ever escaped him. But then the impossible happened. The Hellcat didn't try to turn with him. It didn't run. It did something that violated every rule of air combat as Fouquet understood it. It went vertical. Fouquet watched in stunned amazement. The Hellcat simply pointed its nose toward the sky and climbed, not slowly, but with a terrifying, ferocious power he had never seen. The source of this power was something the intelligence reports hadn't adequately conveyed. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, a 2,000 horsepower, 18-cylinder engineering marvel. It produced over 700 more horsepower than the Zero's Nakajima Sakai engine. That engine was now pulling the 6-ton Hellcat upward at a staggering 1,170 meters per minute. Fouquet, trying to follow, felt his lightweight Zero tremble. His speed dispersed rapidly as his less powerful engine struggled against gravity. The hunter had suddenly, inexplicably become the prey. At 4,500 meters, the Hellcat pilot executed a maneuver that shouldn't have been possible for a plane of its weight. A perfect hammerhead stall turn, a graceful and lethal pirouette in the sky that reversed its direction and positioned it directly above Fouquet. Plunging onto his tail like a hawk, the American pilot opened fire. Fouquet's report captured the shock. 6 machine guns, not the 4 we expected. The volume of fire was unprecedented. In 3 seconds, 1,750 caliber rounds tore through his Zero's unarmored fuselage. The noise was deafening. The impacts shook his entire body. Only by instinctively throwing his plane into a desperate spin did he manage to escape the stream of tracers. He barely managed to bring his riddled aircraft back to Marcus Island. His wingman, petty officer, second-class Massau, never returned. Neither did the reconnaissance plane they were supposed to protect. The first blood had been drawn, and it was the Hellcats. Fouquet's report sent a tremor of confusion through the Japanese command. The fat, clumsy American plane wasn't supposed to be able to do that. It wasn't supposed to be able to climb. The rules, it seemed, were changing. Just a week later, on October 5th, the lesson was driven home with even greater brutality over Wake Island. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga led a flight of 12 Zeros to intercept what they assumed was another minor hit-and-run raid by American carriers. They climbed to 6,600 meters, positioning themselves perfectly. Below us, 12 F-6F fighters, Shiga wrote in his diary. We held every advantage: altitude, position, surprise. Victory was certain. This would be a textbook engagement, a classic bounce from above. The Zeros dove, but as they screamed down on the unsuspecting Americans, the Hellcat pilots did something baffling. They didn't panic, they didn't scatter, they didn't even try to turn and engage. They simply held their formation, nose down in a gentle dive, and accelerated. The Zeros, built for agility, not speed in a dive, struggled to catch the heavier, more streamlined Hellcats. As the Japanese pilots opened fire from maximum range, hoping for lucky hits on the unarmored American planes, they saw their bullets spark off the fuselages with little effect. They were hitting planes built with that 96-kilogram cocoon of armor around the pilot, with self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb dozens of hits and seal the punctures. The Zero, a plane that could be brought down by a handful of well-placed rounds, was firing at a flying tank. Then, as the Zeros pulled out of their dives, having wasted precious altitude and ammunition, the Hellcats executed their counterattack. But it wasn't a dogfight. It was a physics lesson. They didn't turn. They used their immense engine power and their weight, the very thing the Japanese had laughed at, as a weapon. They climbed. They used their superior horsepower to regain altitude at a rate the Zeros simply couldn't match. At high altitude, the Zero's non-supercharged engine gasped for air. Its performance dropped dramatically. At 7,500 meters, the Hellcat was still a beast. Shiga watched in horror. They came down on us like hawks on sparrows, he wrote. Their weight gave them speed. We couldn't match. They would dive, fire with those 6 terrible weapons, then climb away before we could react. It was a massacre. The Hellcats refused to play the Zeros game. They refused the turning duel. They fought on their terms using slashing high-speed passes. What American pilots called boom and zoom tactics, dive, fire, climb, repeat. It was clinical, efficient, and utterly devastating. 8 Zeros were shot down in minutes. Not a single Hellcat was lost. The myth of the Zero's invincibility was shattered over Wake Island. The Japanese pilots had brought their swords to the duel, but the Americans had shown up with rifles and were shooting them from a hill 1.5 kilometers away. The terrifying truth was dawning across the Pacific. The Hellcat wasn't designed to outturn the Zero. It was designed to make turning irrelevant. The Americans had looked at the Zero, strengths and weaknesses, and created a machine and a doctrine designed specifically to nullify the former and exploit the latter. This new American doctrine was called energy fighting. It was a philosophy of air combat that treated a fighter not as a dueling sword, but as a reservoir of kinetic and potential energy. Speed was kinetic energy. Altitude was potential energy. The goal was to always have a higher energy state than your opponent. Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thack had developed a tactic called the Thack Weave, where 2 friendly fighters would fly in a pattern that constantly covered each other's tails, luring enemy fighters into the guns of their partner. This, combined with the Hellcat's strengths, created a deadly new system. Japanese pilots trained as individual samurai were now facing a coordinated, ruthless machine. Lieutenant Commander Takeo Tanimizu, a 32 victory ace, tried to explain this new reality to his pilots at Rabaul in November 1943. "Forget everything you know about air combat," he told them with a grim voice. "The Americans have changed the rules. They no longer fight our battle. They fight like executioners, not like warriors." He explained how the Hellcats worked in pairs, a leader and a wingman, one high, one low. While a Zero pilot was desperately trying to turn with one, the other was already diving on him from above. Their radios, Tanimizu noted, which we ridiculed for adding weight, allow them to coordinate perfectly. We fly as individual samurai. They fight as a single machine. This was the heart of the matter. Japan had perfected the warrior. America had perfected the system. And the system extended far beyond the cockpit. The Americans had a secret weapon the Japanese couldn't even comprehend: radar-guided fighter direction. While Japanese pilots scanned the vast, empty sky with the naked eye, relying on instinct and luck, Hellcat pilots were being guided toward their targets by controllers on the carriers below. These controllers stared at glowing radar screens that could see Japanese formations from 80, 120, even 150 kilometers away. They were chess masters positioning their Hellcat pieces for a perfect checkmate. Lieutenant Sadamu Komachi described the terrifying experience. "We were climbing through the clouds when they hit us. No warning, no visual contact. Hellcats diving from above, exactly on our heading, perfectly positioned. They knew where we were, our altitude, our course. We were blind men fighting those who could see in the dark. The technological gap was becoming an abyss. The Hellcat's 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns fired a total of 4,500 rounds per minute. Each bullet was a heavy, high-velocity projectile that carried 4 times the kinetic energy of the Zero's smaller, 7.7mm rounds. A 1-second burst from a Hellcat put a devastating amount of lead in the air, enough to shred the Zero's delicate, unarmored frame. The Zero was a glass cannon. The Hellcat was a flying anvil, and it was falling on them from great height. But perhaps the most decisive factor wasn't the planes, the tactics, or even the radar. It was the pilots. Japan had started the war with a small elite group of the best trained pilots in the world. Their training program was legendarily difficult, required 3 years and at least 700 flight hours before a pilot saw combat. They were truly the best of the best, but they were a finite resource, and the Hellcat was killing them faster than they could be replaced. By early 1944, the relentless attrition was catastrophic. The demanding 3-year program was a distant memory. New Japanese naval pilots were being rushed to the front with barely 300 flight hours, then 200. Crippling fuel shortages meant most of that training was done on gliders or obsolete aircraft. Gunnery practice was limited to a handful of rounds. They were being sent into combat against the deadliest fighter system ever created with barely enough training to take off and land safely. Meanwhile, the American war machine operated on a different scale of reality. The United States had a massive systematic pilot training program. American pilots arrived in the Pacific with a minimum of 300 hours, often more, with at least 50 of those hours on the Hellcat itself. They had fired thousands of practice rounds. They had practiced carrier landings until it became muscle memory. They had learned energy fighting tactics in the safe skies over Texas and Florida, not in a life-or-death struggle against veteran aces. Lieutenant Commander Yoshihiro Hashimoto, a training officer in Japan, wrote a heartbreaking final report. "We are sending children to fight professionals." Yamamoto NN arrived at the front yesterday. He had never fired his guns in flight. "We have no ammunition for practice." He had never flown at night. "We have no fuel for such training." He lasted 7 minutes in his first combat. The samurai were all dead. Now Japan was sending peasants with swords to face a mechanized army. The culmination of all these factors, the superior aircraft, the revolutionary tactics, the radar, the overwhelming pilot skill gap, led to a single horrifying day. In June 1944, that would forever be known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese Navy, in a desperate gamble, committed its entire remaining carrier force to operation. A plan for a decisive battle to destroy the American fleet in the Philippine Sea. They gathered 9 carriers and 450 aircraft, scraped together from every corner of the empire. No, this was it, the last stand. Against them sailed the U.S. Navy's Task Force 58, 15 carriers, over 950 aircraft, including 450 F-6F Hellcats. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa launched his attack in 4 waves, still clinging to the belief that the superior range of his aircraft and the Bushido spirit of his pilots would prevail. The first wave of 69 aircraft was detected by American radar when they were still 240 kilometers away. The chess game began. Shipboard fighter directors calmly vectored dozens of Hellcats to the perfect interception point. They set up the ambush flawlessly with a massive altitude advantage, the sun at their backs approaching from the Japanese planes' blind spots. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, leading the Zero escort, saw them just minutes before the attack. His blood ran cold. He described it as a steel curtain, an enormous terrifying wall of dark blue fighters, stacked in layers from 6,000 to 9,000 meters waiting for them. Every advantage was theirs, he recalled. The engagement was not a fight. It was an execution. It lasted 12 minutes. Of the 69 Japanese aircraft, in that first wave, 42 were shot down. The Zeros tried to engage in their familiar turning dogfights. The Hellcat pilots simply refused. "We'd make a high-side run, shoot one down, and zoom climb back to altitude," reported Commander David McCampbell, the top American Navy ace. They'd try to follow, stall out, and another Hellcat would pick them off. The slaughter continued all day. Wave after wave of Japanese planes flew into the buzzsaw. By the end of the day, Japan had lost 346 carrier aircraft and dozens of other land-based planes. The American losses, just 30 aircraft from all causes. In the ready rooms of the American carriers that night, pilots joked, "Why hell, it was just like an old-time turkey shoot back home." The name stuck. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier air arm, the force that had terrorized the Pacific for 2.5 years, had effectively ceased to exist in a single afternoon. The psychological impact on the few surviving Japanese pilots was profound. They developed what military psychologists would later term Hellcat psychosis. They were no longer fighting other men. They were fighting an invisible, all-seeing system that guided an indestructible monster. Admiral Ozawa wrote in his after-action report, "The enemy's radar-guided fighter direction achieved something we thought impossible. The industrialization of air combat. Our pilots, no matter how skilled, were not engaging planes, but a system." The laughter from that tent at Rabaul had turned into a scream of collective horror. Unable to compete conventionally, Japan resorted to the ultimate act of desperation, the kamikazes. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the father of the kamikaze corps, justified it with cold, brutal logic. If a Zero attacks a carrier conventionally, the probability of success is near zero. The Hellcats will destroy it. If the Zero becomes a bomb, the probability of hitting increases to 30%. The pilot dies either way. At least as a kamikaze, his death has meaning. It was the final tragic admission of the Hellcats' total dominance. The only way to beat the system was to turn their own pilots into guided missiles, hoping to slip through the steel curtain. Even here, the Hellcat proved its worth, transforming from hunter into shield. During the battle for Okinawa in 1945, Japan launched nearly 2,000 kamikaze sorties. Hellcats flew tens of thousands of combat air patrols, forming a protective umbrella over the fleet. They became masters at shooting down the desperate suicide attackers, preventing an estimated 80% of them from ever reaching their targets. It was a grim final chapter, with the Hellcat standing as the final guardian against an enemy that had been technologically and tactically bankrupted. When the war ended, the sheer scale of American industrial might became terrifyingly clear to the defeated Japanese. The Grumman factory in Bethpage, New York, had operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. At its peak, a brand new F-6F Hellcat rolled off the assembly line every single hour. Grumman built over 12,000 Hellcats in just 30 months. In 1944 alone, America produced 35,000 fighter aircraft of all types. Japan in that same year managed to build just over 5,000. Jiro Horikoshi, the designer of the Zero, studied a captured Hellcat after the war, and his conclusion was devastatingly simple. "We designed an aircraft for 1941, he said. They designed an aircraft system for 1945. While we were perfecting the sword, they were building the industrial age." In his last interview before his death in the year 2000, Saburo Sakai, the legendary ace who had laughed at that first intelligence report, was asked about the Hellcat. His words captured the totality of its impact. "The Zero made Japan a great naval power," he said. "The Hellcat made Japan realize it was never as great as it believed. We thought we were samurai. The Hellcat showed us we were just men with obsolete weapons facing the future. Every Japanese pilot who survived the war survived because a Hellcat pilot chose to let them live. That is the ultimate defeat, existing at your enemy's discretion." The Japanese pilots had laughed at the F-6 Hellcat. They laughed at its weight, its size, its ugliness. They saw it as a clumsy, brutish machine, an embodiment of everything they despised about their enemy. But they had failed to understand what that extra weight represented. It represented a bigger engine they couldn't build. It represented armor to protect a pilot they couldn't replace. It represented self-sealing fuel tanks and heavy radios, and a ruggedness that reflected the philosophy of the nation that built it, a nation that could afford to trade metal for human lives.